Welcome everyone. My name is Andreas Bergström and I'm director, actually acting director here at Forest. So Forest is a think tank or policy institute. The Forest means Forum for Reforms, Entrepreneurship and Sustainability. We're a liberal and green think tank. This year we're doing a quite large project on the euro crisis and the aftermath of the euro crisis, sponsored by the Swedish government. Actually, we applied for money and got it. So this is actually our first seminar, which will in what will be a series of seminars, and also we'll have some bigger conference in the end of the year. Not exactly planned yet. And well, just to tell you a little bit about Forest, we work mainly with environmental policies, especially economics in environments, and also migration policy, economics, as we're doing today, and also digital rights and freedoms is our newest area. And we publish a lot of books. You can see a lot of them in the bookshelf over there. Some of them at the table near the entrance, and you're free to take those books with you as you leave. Some of them are, most of them are free. Some of them are not. So just pay someone in the staff if you want one of the books that costs something. So today's subject is, did austerity get the Baltic countries out of the crisis? And with us today is Andris Strazds, who is senior economist at Nordea Bank, Finland. You're from Latvia?
Based in Riga.
Yes. You studied at the Stockholm School of Economics here in Stockholm? Yes. And you're also part-time faculty member at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
And then Andris will have a short presentation to begin with, and after that we'll have a panel, and I think I'll present you as you get up on the stage later on. So, and in the end, of course, there will be time for questions from the audience, and after 1 p.m. I'm sure you can stay on and have informal discussions here. There is nothing else going on here afterwards, so please stay on and talk to us, talk to the panel and so on. So I leave the floor to you now, Andris, to begin with.
Yeah, thank you. So hello everyone. Yes, as Andreas told you, I'm a graduate of Handelshögskolan, but that was 14 years ago. So the little Swedish that I knew then has deteriorated so badly that actually because of me you are forced to have this event in English. Sorry for that, but then again Swedes are so good at English that that should not be a problem. I will really try to be brief. I will just walk you through a couple of charts just to ensure that we are on the same page, because probably people have different levels of background knowledge about what happened in the Baltics during the last decade or so. So what happened? Well, you have probably heard that a classical boom-bust cycle happened, and the focus of today probably is not that much of the boom-bust cycle. It's more on the recovery phase that that has been going on now for about 2 years. Or a bit more than 2 years now. But yes, you can see in the chart that 2005 to 2007, sometimes they are now called the Lance Armstrong years of the Baltics. So that was a bit of doping there, and needless to say, of course, the commercial banks provided part of the doping, but those rates which went 8, 9, 10% real growth rates for 3 years, they were not sustainable. And what followed was a collapse in some of the sectors that were, in particular those sectors that were where the boom was credit-driven, like construction, like trade. And there was a painful adjustment phase in 2009 in particular. That adjustment phase was relatively short, so it didn't last for more than 8 quarters in any of the countries. And following that, we saw quite good, actually quite strong recovery. Of course, there was not the pre-bust growth rates of 8, 9, 10%, so it was more in the range of 4 to 6%. Estonia managed to get a little bit better in 1 year, but other than that, it's more where the long-term potential growth rates, I think, also are. So what was behind that? Clearly, goods exports were very strong after global trade recovered, and after Eurozone trade, and also trade in the EU as a whole recovered. The Baltics have all shown very strong export performance, actually, in terms of export market shares, which I think is one of the key indicators. The Baltics have increased their global and also their intra-EU export market shares about 2 times during last decade, so that shows you the relative strength of the Baltic export sectors. And gradually, of course, this recovery, when it came, it was first in the exporting sectors, but gradually that spilled over to the domestic economies and domestic demand. And we see also fairly strong growth in retail sales, although as you see the year-on-year rates in the last couple of months and last 2 quarters now are somewhat fading off, but still in the positive territory. And we can see that consumer confidence is back actually at, I say, pre-boom levels here. So not pre-crisis levels, but because pre-crisis levels were clearly excessive. There was some overconfidence also on the household side. Yes, so they are back to pre-boom levels. And the deleveraging cycle is now coming to an end as we speak. Actually, Estonia and Lithuania are already very slightly in the positive territory when it comes to year-on-year growth rates. In Latvia, there is still some deleveraging going on, but then you have to consider also that the boom, the credit boom in Latvia was perhaps the most extreme, although the absolute levels in Estonia were as high, but just the growth rates in the 3 years from 2005 to 2007 were the fastest in Latvia. You see also unemployment coming down sharply from the peak reached during the crisis. In Estonia in particular, it's actually at pre-boom levels already. In Latvia and Lithuania still lagging somewhat behind, but clearly that's also one of the drivers behind improvement in domestic consumption. And we see also that after what we call internal devaluation during the crisis years, also wage growth, and not only nominal wage growth, but given the low levels of inflation, also some marginal real wage growth is back, and of course that further supports recovery of the domestic demand. So the CPI levels you can see here, actually the Latvian data include a 0.5 percentage point kind of trick with the VAT rate that the Latvian government did at the middle of last year. But other than that, you see that the price pressures are indeed very moderate. Yes, preempting an answer to a question that I expect from you, will Latvia join the euro, and is Latvia fulfilling the criteria? Yes, it is. At least looking at the technical criteria, starting from September of last year, it has been fulfilling all the Maastricht criteria, including the inflation criterion. And I expect that to continue. So I expect actually the reports by the European Central Bank and the European Commission on the 5th of June to be positive, and then of course the vote by the ECOFIN Council will be more of a formality that. Well, at least I haven't seen any instance of a positive convergence report being followed by a negative vote by the ECOFIN Council. Also, you can see that some of the effects of the euro are already there, in particular with respect to confidence. We see that interbank rates in Latvia and Lithuania have already converged with the euro level, Euribor, and we see also that in particular the credit default swap spreads with Germany, they are also very, very close now in Latvia and Lithuania to Estonian level. While Estonia is, of course, outstanding as a country with very little government debt to speak of. So we see that the market is actually thinking that the governments of Latvia and Lithuania are very trustworthy as borrowers. And then finally, before we can start the discussion, I really don't want to monopolize this. I will just use the opportunity to debunk a popular myth that the Latvia, Lithuania, to some extent Estonia, that they were able to do this just because there was huge emigration. And that actually this emigration was due to how the Baltic states handled the crisis. And I think that's just simply not true. And to prove that, I have tried to put that in perspective. So I think if we make a statement like that, we have to look at what happens in Central and Eastern Europe generally, or what happens in the so-called EU 12 countries, although I use the term EU 12 here to designate not the EU 12 old member states, but actually to designate the new member states. And if you look at the population dynamics, I didn't really manage to gather for all of them the net migration data, but you can safely assume that net migration is about 2/3 of the total, and then natural growth accounts for the other third at most. And you can see actually that in quite many countries the population has been decreasing during last decade, and there are a few countries where it has been increasing. And among those where the population has decreased are Latvia and Lithuania, to a lesser extent Estonia, and then you have on the other end Cyprus, Malta, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic. And well, I was looking indeed for what could explain those trends, and the best correlation I came up with was this. If you take the average GDP per capita, purchasing power standard adjusted here on the horizontal axis, and then you regress the change in population during last decade on it. So you see that you get a very strong correlation with a very high explanatory power, and you see indeed that what accounts for most of the change in population is the relative GDP per capita compared to the EU 15 average. And actually those countries which had high relative levels of income measured to the EU 15 average, so they didn't lose any population. Some of them actually gained population, well, Cyprus being an extreme example, but countries like Slovenia and the Czech Republic also saw some population increase, including some net immigration. And then you see on the other end countries which had income levels which were fairly low compared to EU 15 average, and those countries saw population outflows and net emigration. And I think that's a good explanation for why some countries have seen their population numbers decrease, and some others have seen actually either them stay flat or increase. And I don't see really any correlation, and I didn't find any correlation whatsoever. For example, there is another claim that inequality of income distribution could be behind this kind of thing, and I didn't find any support for that hypothesis in terms of Gini coefficients, for example, on the horizontal axis, and change in population on the vertical. So, and in neither did some other factors explain it. So I just wanted to use this maybe to kick off the discussion. I think that's enough for a monologue from me, and let's see what the others have to say.
Thank you very much, Andris. So I welcome up the panel, please. Cecilia Hermansson, senior economist at Swedbank. which is, I believe, the biggest bank in the Baltic countries, still, Swedbank. And you were until recently chefsekonom at Swedbank, was the English title?
Chief economist.
Yeah. Now you're focusing on your thesis, and you're always very appreciated in the Swedish debate, explaining what the changes in the world means to Swedes' day-to-day lives. Jens Henriksson, head of the Stockholm Stock Exchange, also known by the short name Nasdaq OMX Nordic
Stockholm.
Stockholm, of course, yeah. Formerly Sweden's and also the Nordic and Baltic countries' representative in the IMF. You've also been a state secretary in the finance ministry, for example. Torbjörn Becker, director at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics site at the Stockholm School of Economics, and you're also chairman of the board of the Kiev Economic Institute in Ukraine and CEN-EA in Poland, and also active in Georgia, I found on the internet. Yes. You also have a background at the IMF as a senior economist. I'd first like to, do you have any direct comments to Andris' presentation? Anyone who wants to have a go? Cecilia, please.
Well, I think it was a very good presentation on the booms and the busts and to explain what has been going on. I think that the whole development has been both giving some costs and some benefits, and I think that what you ended up with on the discussion on demography and emigration, that is, according to my view, one of the costs of this development over the last few years. Even if you might think that there are other explanations, I do think that we should acknowledge that the high unemployment and the income inequality, the poverty, and the problems that very many people have come by and had to actually emigrate to get a job is actually one of the costs. But on the other hand, we've also seen a tremendous success for countries where we probably thought that this will be very difficult with the internal devaluation, with political developments, will it actually keep together? And I think that there are many reasons for why the Baltic countries could do this compared to other countries, for example, in the Southern Europe, and we could probably come back to that. But I do think it's important to acknowledge both that this has been successful, but not without quite large costs involved.
I think we should get back later to if this can serve as an example for other countries. But first, is this a sustainable recovery, or is it more of a rebound effect? Can we say something about that already, or is it too early? Anyone who wants to, maybe Torbjörn?
Well, I mean, it's clearly a rebound. If you lose 20% of GDP, it would be surprising to not have any kind of growth rate if things look better. So, I mean, that's clearly that element in it. But of course, they did other things that supported this. And I guess, I mean, I would highlight that the biggest sort of positive in Latvia and the other countries is that they managed to keep somehow the political system together and keeping people out of the streets and basically burning down parliament, which I'm sure would have happened in a lot of other countries. So, I mean, that's really the big surprising thing to me, that could be avoided. I don't think it was a super duper success story all along the way, but of course now it is looking much better than Southern Europe. But I think we have to remember it's coming out from a very, very significant economic crisis. And just maybe one short comment on the population thing. I wasn't actually sure what your conclusion was going to be when you showed that picture, because if you look at the regression line, Latvia and Lithuania are clearly the big outliers. If you look at Poland at the exact same income level, the gap is basically a 15 percentage point difference. So, I mean, something is behind that, and I think sort of the economic crisis is one of the factors that explains that. But I mean, I also think we should realize that if people did not have the option to actually leave Latvia for a time or Lithuania for a time in a crisis like that, they would be even worse off. So I think this is one of the benefits of having the European market where we can move around. That has actually reduced sort of the problems for the people involved here. But again, it has been associated with a cost, of course, for many families.
So what you're saying is that immigration has played a certain role, but it's not necessarily a problem. It's maybe...
No, I mean, it has been an outlet. Instead of an unemployment insurance that can cover you when you're not having an income from working, you have an opportunity to move somewhere else. People have not been kicked out of the country. I mean, so that tells me that with free choice, they went somewhere else and had a better opportunity.
I'll let Andris get back in a second.
Okay.
Just to, I'd first like to let in Jens as well,
sure.
maybe say something. Do you believe, will the growth continue in the Baltics?
Yes.
Yes.
I think, but let me get back to what you started, sort of giving a few comments on Andris. I think it was a good presentation, and I think it showed that what we should not forget, and that is that the Baltics really screwed up. Now we talk about the sort of success story, but never forget that it was due to the astonishing failure in the beginning, and I think that's important to remember. And we all have the responsibility. I worked at the Ministry of Finance until 2006. We did not talk as much. You, Cecilia, you were chief economist at the bank that fueled this. You have a big responsibility. And let's be honest. And then I think also the Baltic countries itself has quite a responsibility. I remember going there in 2007, and we had long discussions about the problems there, and they did not really realize, even though they had a 23% current account deficit. Now, when all that said, I think the Baltics handle it pretty good. And I think the key reason for that is the ownership. And I will never forget when I was called, it was Ilmars Rimsevic, the central bank governor of Latvia, who called me and said, we need help in going through the IMF. And I had just worked with Iceland on their program, and I helped them sort of work out all the things. And then I traveled to Latvia. And I was standing with the Prime Minister Godmanis, and we were standing alone in a room. And he said that that we would now try to do this with the peg fixed. And I said that, Mr. Prime Minister, that will be very tough. And he answered, and he looked at me and said, tough? Come on, tough when I was out talking after we left the Soviet Union. I was the Prime Minister, and I know that when they had KGB snipers out there pointing guns at me, that was tough. And then I sort of understood that I'm not really playing in his league. Now, let me say one more thing before I get sort of answer your question, and that is that there is sometimes a discussion in the sort of Sweden, like the Swedish choice to support this was to help the Swedish banks. I can tell you that I've never heard that discussion. I've talked, I don't know how many hours with Minister Borg and with with Governor Ingves about this. It was never an issue to save the pegs, to save the Swedish banks. It was, the key point was that this was a decision taken by a neighboring country, and as such, if the neighboring country takes the decision, you are there as a good neighbor and support that. You can have your views whether it's good or bad. Now, getting to your question, if you look on the future, I would like to quote Rahm Emanuel, now the governor of I think it's Chicago, and he said, you must use never let the crisis go by and not use it. And I think that is the key point here. It was a crisis. It was stupidly that you got into that. It was handled pretty good. And now what you can do is to use the crisis to make the Baltic economies better. Very much like we did in Sweden. So in Sweden, we raised the potential growth from 2.5%, but because of the budget consolidation program. But you have to remember, it has a cost, all this. If you look on the structural unemployment in Latvia, IMF estimates it to be around 10%, and that is problematic. So I need to do more reforms, but there is a golden opportunity to continue along the way.
Andris, something quick on...
Now I have a a few points already. I think on the net emigration thing, it's true that it decelerated in the boom years when, for example, wages were growing in some years at 20% a year, and it accelerated again in the bust years when there was the internal devaluation thing going on. But still, it was all the time going on. So that was just my point, that as long as we don't meet a certain level of income, don't reach a certain level of income in relative terms to the EU 15, it will continue going on despite the kind of boom-bust cycle that we lived through. And of course, as you say, I completely agree that the EU freedom of movement played a large role in it. And of course, it would have been much worse if the people had been forced to stay in Latvia rather than look for employment opportunities elsewhere. And finally, on the recovery and the sustainability of the recovery, I think well, yes, it looks sustainable, and I would not label it a rebound anymore, because it has been going on for more than 2 years now, and it still keeps going. And I also don't like usually this comparison with the pre-boom level, the 2007 level, because I on purpose made this Lance Armstrong reference, and I think that in 2007 the Baltic economies were economies on steroids, and it's not fair to compare their current performance with the steroid period. So I think this kind of comparison is simply not very relevant. And finally, what makes me also think that this current recovery is sustainable is that it's very balanced. The budget deficits are very, very low. In Latvia last year, 1.5%. And the current account is also pretty much in balance compared to the pre-crisis level. So that makes me think that it's really sustainable.
I'd like to get over to Euro membership and the pros and cons of that. But first, Cecilia, short.
I wanted to also comment on the responsibility of banks, because I think that you all sit here and want me to do that, and especially since you also brought it up. And I think that it's, of course, something very strange that Swedish banks, where the bank management had been part of the Swedish finance and real estate bubble in the beginning of the 90s, actually could contribute to a similar, very similar crisis just like 15, 20 years later. And of course, I think this must be something that I hope that research will get into much more in depth and look into. But I think that the people that worked, my predecessor, for example, who was chief economist at the time, Hubert Fromlet, the department warned the bank management about all the macroeconomic difficulties and imbalances. But the bank management at that time had other views. And I think we have to remember the context, that the whole financial system in the world was based on imbalances and overconfidence. In the US, all over. It was not only in the Baltics or in Sweden and so on. So we had overconfidence, too much lending. And one very, very important mistake, I think, from the bank's perspective, was to say that this could be taken care of by the Baltic bank management. Let them decide. We will sort of let them do their job. We can trust them. So I think looking back, at that time there were very few people in the risk departments. Today, banks are crowded with risk people. So this whole financial crisis has taught the banks a lot. And the sad part of this is that the bank management at that time would probably say today it was worth it. We got the new money from our shareholders. The shares are up at very good levels again. What have we actually lost? So from a bank management perspective, maybe not enough was actually learned. That's my view. They were not punished enough.
Yeah, if I can have 3 sentences on that. Actually, in 2007, I remember in Latvia, particularly speaking about Latvia, actually the bankers got together and they went to the government and they said to the government, and that's a true story, they said to the government, now do something about it. This is crazy. But we, if somebody single-handedly stops lending sharply, we'll just lose market share. All the other guys will benefit at our expense. If we sit together and we kind of make a cartel agreement, then we'll have the competition council immediately in our back. But the government at that time, okay, it was fairly late in the process already, but the government at that time said, oh no, that's kind of your issue. We don't see much of a problem there.
If you want to read a very good book on the beginning of the crisis, you can buy Finanskrisen förklarad, a book that we sell at the entrance. So Latvia hopes to join the euro in next year, and probably will. There are some countries who maybe think that it's shaky, but they fulfill all the criteria as it looks now. And Lithuania probably in 2015, maybe somewhat later. Why do they want this now? And also, I mean, Estonia joined more or less in the middle of the crisis. Why do they want this now, considering the euro's clear institutional troubles? We see that this is not really a fully functional currency union.
If I may start answering that, I think your question already included a part of the keywords for the answer, and indeed it is a strong belief among the government in Latvia, and I think now also Lithuania starts converging to that belief that it's all political actually, and that as you mentioned, the institutional frame of the eurozone and the EU in general is undergoing some quite dramatic changes, and there is a political argument that we want to be at the decision-making table, which is the eurozone table, and we want actually to shape those changes rather than just passively look at them and then in any way will be affected by them in the end as a small economy on one side of the EU. So I think that's the main argument. Of course, I will not go through the kind of small economic arguments for the euro, but the main argument is now political. Just I think that's important to understand.
Because, I mean, another way to put it is that they're actually jumping onto a sinking ship, you could say, helping to mend it.
I don't really think that's the case. In particular, you have very many strong economies in the Eurozone. You have Germany there, you have the Netherlands there, you have Austria, you have Finland, you have Estonia. So there is certainly a core in the Eurozone which will stay together even in the really worst case scenario, which I also don't see happening, but I think we'll still then be part of that part of the euro anyway.
Torbjörn, you want to?
Well, I mean, it's clearly, like you said, a political thing. Jens has this chart that's in the IMF report about the public support for the euro now, and it's basically 15% in Latvia saying that they actually want to join the euro.
Now it's somewhat more already.
A bunch of them say they're neutral, but the majority is actually against it now. But so I think it's more on the politician side today that we have the very strong support for the euro. I'm not saying who's wrong or right here, but I think the public opinion has certainly shifted.
But you're afraid to say who's wrong or who's right here?
No, I think they should have been allowed in when they had the crisis. That's when they needed a confidence boost. I don't see that they actually need a confidence boost today, but they may have other reasons for joining now. They may want to be part of this, and that was always the political goal of being part of the euro. So, I mean, I can see that. I think actually the timing is extremely bad, if you ask me. Who wants to join the sinking ship now when they're actually doing relatively well? I would say, I know that's selfish, and I sometimes say that Swedish politicians are a bit coward because they take this kind of view, but I think when Latvia had to go through all this suffering without the support of having the euro, now all of a sudden they want to join? Well...
Jens?
Well, I have a few views there. The first one is that I agree with your sort of the public support, but still you have to remember that if Latvia, the reason they they got the package was because they said they would join it. I mean, it's absolutely built in stone. So I had huge problems working with the IMF, and I worked, I don't know how many hours I've been really screaming with Strauss-Kahn then about how, because the point was that they did not want Latvia to keep the peg. Now, how did they find a way out? Well, the key point they found a way out was that because there is an end to it. So when you have the fix join the euro, then you can be here and then you can deduct yourself backwards and say, okay, thereby you can keep the peg. Without having an explicit goal to join the euro, it would never come through. It would not have the support of the Americans, we would not have support of the IMF, and I think not in the end the euro as well, the European Commission as well. So I think that's the key thing to keep in mind. Now, then you can of course use your argument, and that sort of is the old Marxist argument that I would never join a club that would accept me as a member. But the key point here is of course that you need to ask, okay, so if I'm not joining, what am I going to do otherwise? I mean, that's the complicated question. Because, well, would you want to stay in the ERM for a longer while? Is that, well, I'm not sure, because then you get all the problems with the euro, but without the say on the table, and you still have this exchange risk and blah, 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 and it's complicated. Okay, then we're going through this argument. I think we've thought about it, I don't know how many years now. But in the end, also, if you'd had a floating exchange rate, hey, this is a small country. I mean, let's face it, Sweden is a small country, but this is a lot smaller. They cannot be a single currency in today's world. I think Sweden is on the verge of being able to be a country by itself. And it's the same problem as we have in Iceland. I mean, they need to have capital controls, because without capital controls, it would just go ballistic back and forth. You cannot have small currencies in today's market and today's financial system. You need to find a way out. So yes, I think it's the right way to go. When they took the decision, it's the right way to continue to go.
Yeah, maybe to rephrase that, there is not kind of expectation of additional confidence when joining the euro, but there is clearly an expectation of confidence loss if we now start playing around with the issue and actually don't join.
We shouldn't have all the debates from 10 years ago here again.
But this is important but I still think it's interesting what you say, Torbjörn, that they should have joined in the time of the crisis, and I do think that for the European Central Bank and the Eurozone, it's very difficult to bring in new members without sort of looking at their situation and also the sustainability and having it in a better way. And for me, it's kind of interesting that you say this, because you were actually one of the ones who wanted the countries to devalue, and that's why I think it's strange that you have that comment now. I think it has served all the three countries well that they stuck with the peg and that they tried to get into the Eurozone. And if you thought that the Eurozone was a sinking ship, would the euro have the value it has right now then? I mean, then we wouldn't think that the euro was anything. I mean, then it would be a much worse crisis. So I wouldn't like to even describe it as a sinking ship. I mean, we know the US has also problems, political ones, and the European zone is much more difficult with much more problems of banking unions and fiscal pacts and all that. But still, if it was a sinking ship, it would already be a crisis. So I sort of understand why these, like you say, Jens, three relatively small countries which had the peg for decades now, and also, if you look at Latvia, has like 90% of the debt in euro. And also to get hold of a much bigger capital market. There are economic, not only political reasons for joining, as far as I can see it.
Can I just get back?
I think we should...
Yeah, 1 second though, because the whole argument with getting the euro at that time was to actually make a one-time devaluation and join at an appropriate exchange rate. That would be a credibility boost, and that was the whole argument. So I mean,
I can't remember you saying that at that time.
No, I did say that like 5 times, but that's okay. It's a long time ago.
I think,
but that was the whole.
But I need.
And that was actually. Let me just finish. That was exactly what the IMF also proposed and said that's not an option because the EU will not allow it. So and
the Latvians did not want it. Let's not forget that. They did not want it.
Yeah, but I mean, if we just say what would have made sense, that would have made sense then. It didn't work that way, and now we're here.
So I need one more comment on that, and it was actually about the friction in the system, so to say. So in a way, we actually moved by the way of least or lesser friction. And let me explain that. So Cecilia mentioned the big amount of euro-denominated loans. So what would actually, even a one-off devaluation, what would it have meant? It would have meant that many companies, in particular, would be sent into insolvency overnight. And then just look at the global competitiveness index and look where Latvia, for example, stands, unfortunately, in terms of court efficiency and in terms of efficiency of insolvency proceedings. We stand somewhere ranked around 100 out of 144 countries. So that would have meant a long period of actually very many assets in the economy, productive assets being kind of clogged up and really economy being stuck. So I think that was one of the major arguments which has been little maybe explained, but one of the major arguments for keeping the peg.
I think that argument was made over and over again. The thing was that it still had 20-25% of non-performing loans. I mean, this way had the same sort of
maybe then it would have had 40.
Yeah, okay. So we'll have another hour just about this, because we've had a very heated debate about the euro, pros and cons in Sweden. So, but let's move on. Andris has actually written co-authored an interesting article about this friction, and on Vox EU you can find. That's actually how we found you.
Okay.
So
okay.
So
good to know.
We should widen our horizon a bit here and compare the situation to other countries in the eurozone. I think. Is there something to be learned here? Can the Baltic countries be seen as examples for Greece, for example, for Italy? For what are the differences? What is there to learn? Anyone who wants to begin?
Well, I mean, I mentioned it before. I think sort of the fact that you don't have people out writing on the street when you do programs like this, that's the biggest difference. But I mean, when we also say austerity in Latvia, we should remember that they had a deficit of 10% of GDP in the government, and they could have that because the EU and the IMF put together this package, so they could actually finance a deficit like that. So sometimes when we say what a great austerity example this is, well, I mean, the deficit is still about 5-6%. It's going in the right direction. It's going to be 3 soon. But I mean, during the crisis, Latvia had very large deficits, and it was made possible with this external financing. And there is a role to play with that kind of fiscal policy in a time like that. So it needs to be kept in mind. It wasn't like they went to the surplus overnight. That wasn't this case.
Yeah, I think it was gradual, but then again it was not too gradual, and I think that's the big difference. If I were to name one factor, that we actually did it rather quickly. So we front-loaded all the negative things, and we actually had it over pretty much within 2 years. If you look at Greece, well, I'm not definitely an expert of Greece, and I would not give any advice probably to Greece, but I think if I were still to give one piece of advice, a couple of years back, I would say do it quickly, because in Latvia you can say, okay, there was a kind of terrible end at one point, but in Greece it's rather endless terror. So if you compare a terrible end with an endless terror, I think the first one is the better option.
I also think that front-loading was good, but it's also that it was possible in these countries, because I think that the confidence for politicians is higher there than, for example, in Greece. It's even higher in the Nordic countries. So trust is important. And also the historical context, and I think that you have already mentioned this, that coming from a period with very high wage growth and the economy building up, becoming so much better compared to what they have seen many years ago and with the Soviet, being part of the Soviet Union. So it is very difficult to compare the Baltic countries with the southern European countries. They are very, very different. But I still think that the front loading was important, the austerity starting off, and also trying to do things in a way where there was some transparency also. And I think that Latvia, for example, getting a loan of about 37.5 or something % of GDP actually ended up not borrowing so much. I think it was like 25% of GDP at the end. Compare that to Greece, which is more than 100% of GDP, and where Greece actually increased the number of civil servants during the time of the crisis. So I think the crisis awareness came very fast to the Baltic countries. We need to do something. And lastly, I think also comparing the different regions is difficult, because in the Baltic countries you had the banks from the Nordic countries, and you could say this was a problem to start with, but it was actually something good, because the Nordic banks did not have the problems as the Greek banks have today. So in that sense, having possibilities, even if I do recognize at this stage that maybe the lending could be a bit higher to some of the small and medium-sized companies, for example.
Was the Swedish government's guarantees to the Swedish banks acting in the Baltic states important?
Well, yes, it was important.
Extremely important.
Yes, otherwise, I mean, so even if Swedish banks, if you take Swedbank, for example, got new money through their own shareholders, I think that was very crucial, but it was also crucial with the state guarantee.
Yeah. If I would say a few things, I would first say one of the lessons is that you can win elections on austerity. And that was exactly the same thing as happened in Sweden in the beginning of, in 98, when there was a social democratic government who went on really hard on the electorate and then gained was still in power. And I think that's the same thing that happened in Latvia. So that's the first point. The second point is that I think it's hard. You have to remember it's a small country, and that means that in many ways it's if you do something really big at one time, you can free ride a bit on the others. And I think that's a bit what the Baltic countries did. They did extremely a lot, and that has not big Keynesian effects on other countries, and then you could use that back. But if you would do the same thing in the whole euro area and do the same thing in the US, it would be really dangerous for the world economy. So you can do things like that in small economy. The third thing I think about this, and that is the feeling for the country. And that is if I think on the Kennedy, so don't think what you can do, what the government can do for you, but what you can do for the government, for your country. And that's a big difference, especially here in Forest, I can imagine. No, but I think the key point here is that if you take Latvia is or the Baltics, those are countries that has a strong feeling of being to the state and to the country. But if you take Greece, there is no trust and no feeling. Greeks don't feel like, they've been an occupied state for I don't know how many 100 years and been an independent state for a very short time. And that means that there's been people do not trust government, and thereby they feel they can cheat with taxes, and the government does not trust people, and thereby you have corruption. So there's a mistrust in Greece, which you do not have the same in the Baltic countries. And then the final thing I think also remember is that if you look on a lot of people now got poorer compared to 2008, but if you just go back to 2005, they are back to the same level. So people are okay with being taken away a few years of economic growth, but it's a difference with other countries.
Paul Krugman has been very high profile in the discussions. Has he been simply wrong, or has he been maybe...
He has not been that vocal. Krugman has been, he had a few posts, but he has not been that vocal.
I don't agree. I think he has been very vocal, and he's been quarreling with Baltic governments and
which
states.
is somewhat unusual, actually, to get into the debate in that way. Has it been wrong? I mean, there is clearly recovery now.
Well, I think that he takes his context from the American situation, a little bit like what you say now, that in being more Keynesian in that way, that you should have more stimulus in a period of low growth. But he kind of forgets about financial markets and the confidence. Small countries in Europe cannot continue stimulating if the financial markets give an interest rates of 20-30%. So I don't think he understands the European context.
What I said was, and what I tried to do is to say that I think he has not talked that much about the Baltic states.
Oh, yes.
Can I answer? Can I finish my sentence? Yeah. Thank you. I think he has said that using the Baltics as a poster child for the other countries to do exactly the same thing. And I think those are two different things. I think that sort of it's hard to say that you should use this experience of the Baltics on other countries. I think that's the key point, and I agree with a bit of that.
Torbjörn, one last comment, then I think we should let in some questions.
No, I mean, if it's now talking about Latvia and Greece, the key difference is the starting point on public debt. I mean, if you start with public debt at 10% of GDP like Latvia, or if you start up here, where you already have questions about that sustainability, of course you can't do the same fiscal adjustment program. Of course it's much harder to gain credibility for Greece than Latvia. So I mean, that simple little starting point is extremely important, because that determines the whole debt dynamics and what politicians can do, basically.
That's true, but looking at Ireland starting with a very low debt and coming up to 90% very quickly, you could actually start, if you have a banking system that goes bust, you can end up having 100% very quickly.
No, absolutely, but if you want to compare Latvia and Greece, Latvia didn't have to bail out the whole banking system because it's you that are there. But
so the structure of the banks being foreign would actually be a benefit.
But I mean, the whole debt dynamics hinges on that.
Yeah, I think we could have another hour just on austerity versus Keynesianism, actually maybe 5 hours or something. There's also this very interesting debate now about this Rogoff and Reinhardt paper, where they said that if you get more than 90% of GDP in debt, you'll get very low growth. And now this paper has been challenged. Someone has shown that, an actual graduate student has shown that they miscalculated this. So now I think the people like Paul Krugman think that they're even more right than they thought that they were before. So, but I think that would be like 5 more hours. So I think, are there questions from the audience? There's a very, very interesting audience as well today, if you look at the list. Please.
I'm interested in the...
Please state your name as well.
My name is Carly Skoppers. I worked with SIDA in development for many years, and also a few years in Latvia. Being from a development economist, I'm interested in the development issues. All of you have stated clearly that you can't compare Latvia on the one hand with Greece and Cyprus, so that's obvious. We all know it's institutional factors, schooling, political factors. Well, that's development for you. So we know if Latvia can do an internal devaluation, which is really difficult, we can't expect it to happen in the south. I'm wondering, would it happen in Western Europe? Could Sweden, Germany, Holland have carried out an internal devaluation of this tough measure that Latvia did?
I can start.
Yeah, we have the same institutional and development.
Yeah, that's good. Short questions.
I think it's very difficult to know, but I think that one thing that we haven't talked so much about is the flexibility of wages and the labor market in the Baltic countries. And often we have to acknowledge this as one of the factors why the internal devaluation actually worked quite well. But there were also other factors. A lot of people were let go, and they actually shrank the public sector. So it was not only reducing nominal wages, but it was actually possible to do that, and it might be much, much more difficult in other parts of Europe, I think. I don't know which.
Yeah, I would maybe answer that by going back to Jens' comment about the trust issue. I'm actually not as optimistic as you are about the trust in the governments in the Baltic states. I think there is also quite a bit of distrust, and there is also tax avoidance and grey economy issues. But I think what was the real difference was that in '92, when the Soviet economy had collapsed, and well, the market economy was just being built, GDP actually fell in a single year by 1/3. So then now you compare the 18% that we had in 2009 with what happened in 1992, and in particular taking into account the steroid period. So that was viewed, at least by some part of the population, as a kind of, well, not perhaps healthy adjustment, but a necessary adjustment, and that explains partly why there was well, so little public unrest. We actually had just one night of some violence in the old town at one point, but that was it.
Well, I think what you could say then is that we tried in Sweden. I mean, you have to remember the sort of the three crisis packages in '92. Sort of the first one passed through, the second one passed through, and then the third one, when that did not pass through, then the currency fell. So I think there is, I would say, at least in Sweden, there would be a try by politicians to do it. Then if we would then get the support from the people, it's hard to say.
I mean, I think the most significant example, though, is Germany. Germany was called the sick man of Europe not so long ago, and they actually had a big adjustment of real wages and benefits, etc., and did pretty much what needs to be done in the rest of Europe. So Germany did it and became the powerhouse of Europe. Tell that to French politician, he's not so amused.
But also keep in mind is that the unit labor cost, if you look on sort of unit labor cost on privately employed people, the only figures I've seen is from Latvia, then it's not that much change. You're down like 3 or 4%. But it mainly was done in the public sector with wage cuts of 25%.
Please, more questions from the audience.
I'm Katri Heinapõld, representing Estonian Embassy. It was very interesting debate here today. Coming from the Eurozone country, it surprises me, this discussion about Euro in Sweden, because when Sweden joined the EU, in the accession agreement already it said that every country should be a member and it's not optional. And Sweden has no exemption from this. And now when Latvia is really doing their job, it's even been like a surprise for many, but it's really for Estonians. It's showing us a solidarity of Europe, and I would very much like to hear what are your opinion what are the real risks for Sweden joining. It's now of course politically very unpopular, but in the economical point of view, it will be interesting to hear. And the second point I wanted to make is that the debate is being about the Baltics, but I wanted to point out that we are three very different countries, and of course the economical situation in three countries is also different, and it would be also interesting to hear what are the. It was mainly talk about Latvia, but what are the lessons to be learned from the crisis for Estonia and Lithuania? It would be also interesting to hear.
Yeah, another question directly. Sure.
I will jump on this. If I would jump on this debate, Ambassador of Lithuania on the euro. So I would also probably disagree with some of the arguments that the joining for Lithuania and for Latvia is more of the political. It is a strategic aim of our countries, and which was from the very beginning of our accession to the EU. So I can only confirm that this is the latest information by Friday. We had the Prime Minister of Lithuania, Butkevičius, visiting Sweden. So in his talks with Prime Minister Reinfeldt and both banks, Swedbank and SEB, he reconfirmed Lithuania's interest to join Europe by 2015. But it's not only for the political reason. I think there are more economic reasons also behind this. So for small countries, joining zone is rubber-stamped. And of course, especially in case of the three Baltics, when Estonia is now in, Latvia soon, for Lithuania not joining it would be probably strange. The other reason is also Lithuania is already have the litas, our national currency, page with a euro for already a long period. So we're already benefiting all these influences of the euro fluctuation together with the litas. So we already de facto we are part of the eurozone. If I will still use a few minutes for the few more comments, one is I fully agree with the previous comments, especially by Cecilia on this bank, Swedish bank image in the Baltics. Of course, if you go to ask general public, there are some negative comments, Swedish banks, but in general, if you are sort of like-minded economists, you would understand that, as Cecilia mentioned, that or someone else, that the situation not having not Swedish banks during the crisis would be worse. So this argument that there should be more balanced approach. Of course, there is a negative effect. There was a negative effect of the Swedish banks during the crisis or during this boom period, and we acknowledge this. But also there was our mistake of our governments not to introducing the check and balance system.
I think actually we're running out of time.
My final comments on the immigration. Again, I fully agree that there are. This is probably the most negative side of this story. Booming economies and still very high immigration rate. But if I would I looked at the list, I found one of the Lithuanian representing one of the Finnish company, Technopolis. What the Lithuanian we would have, how we would find Lithuanian? She is from many years experience in London and now in Sweden. We have all Lithuanians somewhere scattered throughout the countries, in Sweden and London. But they bring knowledge, they bring context, they bring understanding, which would be more difficult to do without this white immigration. So I still see some positive element. Sorry for mentioning.
I want to bring the last word to the panel here. So,
could I first answer the question from the Estonian embassy? The first one, there is no exemption for Sweden.
I'm just surprised how
yes.
Pros and cons, but you already have agreed to join. The question is only when.
Okay, but the first one, there is no exemption. But to be a member of the euro, you have to be a member of ERM2 for 2 years, and there is no pressure to join the ERM. So that's the way it's sold. And it's very simple. Swedes do not want to join, and you cannot force. I mean, I think it's that simple. But when it comes to the euro discussion, I think it's important to sort of disentangle the two questions. The first question, is euro good or bad? And we can have our views back and forth, but that's a really complicated academic discussion. I think sort of the overwhelming academic support is getting more and more critical about it. But the second thing is, well, I don't care whether it's good or bad, but now it's there, should we join? And I think that's a different issue, and I think that's sort of where I come from, and I'm still positive that Sweden should join. So I have my doubts about the first one, but now it's there, well, I said we might as well join.
Short from the rest of you. We're already over time, but...
Well, I could say as an answer on yes, all three countries are very different, and we should have started saying that. We should always say that when we talk about the Baltic countries. We didn't say that today. But I think the discussion today was a lot about austerity and the program, and that's why Latvia got to be the example. But Estonia, of course, doing much better in many ways, having the crisis earlier, and also Lithuania managing a bit better, also having a broader economy. And when looking at the possibilities to recover from all this, I still think that all three countries have, but especially Latvia and Lithuania, have challenges on institutional issues, demography, productivity, and trying to avoid imbalances now joining the Eurozone.
Torbjörn, briefly, and
okay.
finish.
No, I agree. There are 3 different countries, and I just want to say I may sound negative somehow. Some people say you're so negative. I'm not negative. I wish the greatest success to all of these countries. I think there were policy mistakes in the past. They are there now. For the future, I just hope things are going to go very well. So that's...
Yeah, that comment from the Estonian embassy was very Estonian, you know, that, okay, we Estonians are more like the Nordics, and then there is this to the south, Latvia and Lithuania. But on the serious side, I think there is one lesson to be learned, and this goes back actually in history to ancient Egypt and to Joseph, and you know this tale about 7 years of affluence and 7 years of famine. And I think yes, you should save during the years of affluence. And Joseph, by the way, saved 20% of the harvest for 7 years. Well, Estonians, they were much worse than that, but they saved some 3% in the public sector for a couple of years, and that helped them greatly during the crisis. And I think that's basically the only thing I think where Estonia really stands apart, and which is to be remembered for the future.
So, okay, we'll finish here. I'm very happy with this discussion. I also have some, it seems I have different sizes here. I think it seems a little bit unfair. Yeah, maybe it's for you. You gave the presentation to begin with. So please stay on for informal discussions. Please take the books, especially the ones that are free. Take the books. The ones that are not free, pay for them. And I'm happy that you came here, and I'm happy to have you back anytime in the future on our future seminars. Thank you all.